if you feel like you're not the best self, it is always okay to take a beat or a pause or say, hey, this is really a really important topic.
Why it's so difficult to have difficult conversations, particularly in this remote hybrid environment that has become more prevalent through COVID.
And they say that 70% of employees avoid difficult conversations with their boss, their peers, or their direct reports.
People like to say, have a good day. And it's a nice sentiment, but it's a fixed perspective that can put a lot of pressure on us. It's also really hard to define from person to person. What about instead if we ask ourselves, how can I have a better day? At work, at home, in life? That's what this show is all about. The Have a Better Day podcast comes to you from Boon, a personalized coaching platform that helps businesses everywhere to support the whole humans, which are their employees. We have our pulse on what employees are dealing with in today's workplace, and we want to share those insights with you. Welcome to the Have a Better Day podcast. Welcome to the first episode. I'm your host, Alex Simmons. At Boon, we're deeply connected to the ever-evolving challenges employees are facing in today's workplace. Through our extensive coaching network, we have our pulse on what challenges are most prevalent and the innovative ways that they can be addressed. This podcast is born out of a desire to amplify the voices of our amazing coaches and to share their invaluable perspectives. Our goal is to offer our listeners practical solutions and strategies for most of the pressing issues in today's modern workplace. Today, we're addressing a critical topic that we continue to hear about across our customer base: navigating difficult conversations in remote and hybrid work settings. This challenge is about more than just communication. It's about fostering healthy, productive relationships in our ever-evolving digital-first world. I'm excited to introduce Diny Chen, an incredibly talented ICF-certified coach with Boon, who's known for her curiosity, energy, and deep commitment. Diny has over a decade of program management experience at Fortune 500 companies like Google and YouTube. So I thought Diny has a really unique perspective into the topic we're discussing today, both through the lens of our own workplace experience, as well as through the Boon clients that she's coaching today. Diny, we're super excited to have you.
Thanks for having me, Alex.
Yeah, and Diny, maybe just for starters, could you just share a little bit about your journey to becoming a coach and I guess like what motivates you in this role today?
Yeah, absolutely. So I work full-time in tech, and what really excited me about becoming a coach was twofold. One is I see a lot of managers in today's tech world who are trained to leverage coaching in their everyday practices. And second, I am a program manager. And as a program manager, you delegate a lot. You tell people what to do. And for coaching, I just really wanted to leverage a different skill set. With coaching, you ask people the right questions to solve their problems. So instead of solving their problems for them, you truly partner. And I thought, wow, what an amazing skill set to bring to my daily practice.
And what was there like an experience or something that happened that led you to, okay, well, I've got to learn more about coaching? Like it sounds like it was something that was always innate, but was there a turning point or something that happened in your career that made you want to pursue coaching further?
Yeah, so it was twofold. First, during the pandemic, I took Tara Mora's Playing Big course. It's a leadership development course for women. And I just really learned about the power of, they talk about oftentimes as women, we're scared. We play small, and there's opportunities to play big and really fully be ourselves in our career and find our passions. And so that course really inspired me. And the second is I had a friend of a friend who was getting coach certified at the time, and she needed some clients, and she offered to be my coach. And I was so honored, and it was so powerful. My own experiences with her, it was so transformative. I was like, I want to help change people for the better and make an impact in people's lives.
I love that. And it's so funny how many of our coaches I talk to where they were informally coaching or delegating in their own role in the workplace and how that evolved into them being a coach in who they are today. And I guess, Diny, kind of diving and dovetailing into our conversation today around just navigating difficult conversations. I mentioned it in the intro, but I think it's so unique to hear your perspective, both being in the work setting as a manager in today's environment and seeing how that has evolved through this remote hybrid workplace, and then also seeing it through the lens of the Boon clients and then private clients that you're working with from a coaching setting. So, how would you describe why it's so difficult to have difficult conversations, particularly in this remote hybrid environment that has become more prevalent through COVID.
Yeah, so what I find really fascinating is there's a few studies out there about difficult conversations. So there's a study by Crucial Conversations and another by Braverly. And they say that 70% of employees avoid difficult conversations with their boss, their peers, or their direct reports. And out of that,
Wow.
another stat is a third of people actually put off having a difficult conversation for at least a month. And 1 in 4 people put it off for at least a year.
Wow.
So why do we do that? It's because there's a dissonance between how we feel and what action we're taking. Sometimes we can feel discomfort. Our emotions are involved. Fear, apprehension, guilt, or anger. We might be conflict adverse. It might be triggering a bad memory of ours, something that happened in the past. It might be a build and pile on of other things that are happening in our lives. Or we might feel uncertainty in the outcome. And so in this remote hybrid world we have today, it can feel even harder remotely because relationships are more difficult to build, especially when you're just joining a new team, you have a new manager, you recently experienced a reorg. It's really hard virtually to read body language virtually. And then we also don't have the benefit anymore of cooler talks. These informal coffee chats, walking over to someone's desk and just chatting. You have to be more intentional about your relationships. And so little moments can feel like bigger ones.
Yeah, I mean, I totally agree with that. And that 70% number is it's kind of a jaw-dropping number when you think about how avoidance plays into that and just the overall implications of that. The other thing that we've been seeing a lot of is just the generational differences in how to communicate. That's something we've been hearing between, a Gen Xer or a baby boomer that's now working with a Gen Z or millennial who has just come into the workplace, and there's a different style of communicating. Have you seen any trends or patterns around just the generational communication gaps or just differences in communicating that have, I guess, potentially contributed to this as well?
I'm sure that there are generational gaps. I see less about the generational gaps and more about people's different communication styles. Like some people are more introverted or extroverted. Some people love talking. Some people are more listeners. And I think the generational gaps are really important to acknowledge, and I'm sure there's plenty of research about that as well. What I sort of focus on is the individual and their style and what makes for their specific situation and need, what makes it harder for them to have these difficult conversations.
Yeah, I agree. It's probably more about the communication styles than necessarily the generational gaps. And I guess along these lines, again, it can be from your own workplace experience or just your own clients that you're working with. But do you have like a specific use case where you can actually point to where you helped an individual or a team actually kind of navigate through how to deal with this conversation that they had coming up remotely? What strategies did you employ, that sort of thing?
Yeah, definitely. And before I do that, I just want to mention like the benefit for HR professionals and businesses and really thinking about these difficult conversations. It's not just really beneficial for employees. So one statistic is employees spend 2.8 hours per week dealing with difficult situations. And then it also has impacts to the business. So for the business, every single conversation failure costs the organization 7,500 and more than 7 workdays. And I found that such a fascinating stat as well. So these conversations are so hard, but they're so important to have. So I have worked with clients. Some of them are in, great work environments. They have difficult conversations, and it's pretty easy because they feel psychologically safe. They have a manager they trust.
Yeah.
But sometimes I also work with clients who are dealing with toxic work environments, difficult managers, challenging stakeholders or clients, or they have ambiguity because they're starting in a new role or company or handling a reorg. So I recently had a conversation with a client where she was pretty new to her manager and she wasn't quite sure. She had a conflict with her manager and she wasn't quite sure how to resolve it. So she came to me to just have a conversation because she really wanted to establish that manager relationship. So what I like to do in these types of conversations is really help them set up before they've had the conversation, their headspace and their mindset. Because it's so important to pause before you have that difficult conversation, and a coach can really help you with that. So thinking about, hey, first of all, is this even a safe place to have this conversation? And if not, what do you need to do to have this safe conversation? And it's a really hard question to answer. Like, is it even worth having that conversation, right? That's why a lot of times we delay or we procrastinate having that discomfort.
Yeah.
Because sometimes we are in difficult situations that are so bad that a conversation isn't enough. There are times when you do need to go to HR, human resources. But if you think it's possible to create that safe space, thinking about first, like, how do we show up? Like, who do we want to be during that conversation? Where do we want to get to during that conversation? And how do we show up with a place of empathy, mutual respect, trust of the other person? So with that individual I was talking about, oh, sorry, were you about to say something?
Well, I was just going to ask. I mean, I think just for me personally, I think the idea of just being really intentional, thinking about how do I want to show up, I think that's really valuable feedback and insight, and having that mindset of empathy and showing up in a certain way. I just know from my own experience, if it is a tough conversation, I might have those, triggering thoughts that are going to potentially make me feel emotional and not acting in my best self in that very moment. So I guess, how do we deal with that feeling that's inevitably going to come up in those tough moments?
Yeah, so I think in the moment, if you feel like you're not the best self, it is always okay to take a beat or a pause or say, hey, this is really a really important topic. I need to spend some time reflecting on it, and let's follow up. Let's regroup at a later time, after you've had time to process, because our emotions can sometimes get in the way of the outcomes we're trying to achieve.
100%. And yeah, go ahead with what you were going to say. I was just thinking about that.
No, and
as you were talking.
it can be so hard. And I want to acknowledge too, we have difficult conversations at work and in our personal lives, and it's hard to be our best selves 100% of the time, right? It's really hard. But how do we show up when it matters most? And how do we be our best selves when it matters most?
100%. And so you mentioned some, strategies around showing up as your best self and kind of taking that safe space if you are emotional and you need to step back for a little bit. What are some keys, do's and don'ts that you would advise when approaching these sorts of conversations?
Yeah, so the first is, how do we come from a place of radical candor? Because sometimes when we are avoiding conversations, we aren't saying what we really truly feel, and we aren't being completely honest with ourselves and the other person. And when we show up as our worst selves, sometimes it can show up in other ways as passive aggressiveness, because other people can read our body languages, our emotional reactions. So how do we really show that, hey, I'm going to be honest, but that honesty is not coming from a place of vitriol or aggression. It's coming from a place of, respect and wanting to build that relationship. The second thing I really like to think about is listening. And coaching teaches you a lot of these strategies. So how do you listen? Not just to respond. Like, if you and I are having a conversation, Alex, a lot of times it's very natural. You're saying something. I'm immediately thinking, how am I going to reply to you? But instead of that, I'm paying attention to, like, oh, what is Alex truly saying right now? What is he not saying? What is his body language? What do I see on his face as his emotions? And how do I listen to truly listen to him instead of listening for my own response?
I love that. And I guess you mentioned coaching has been a really helpful way to navigate. Like, walk me through that a little bit more in terms of the actual elements of how coaching plays a role in these sorts of conversations. Does a client come to you and they present this issue that they're having at work, and you're kind of giving them advice on how to handle it? How does that conversation typically go from a coaching lens? How does that work in this setting?
So my favorite thing about coaching is it teaches you how to tame your advice monster. And so in coaching, we really believe that it's a partnership with you and the client. The client knows their story and they know what's going on better than you ever will as a coach. So how can you leverage coaching tools and methodologies to ask them the right questions? Because they know the answers within themselves, and it's unlocking the right questions. So it might be things like I mentioned earlier. I work with clients a lot on their best self and figuring out who that is. And so how does that best self show up when you're in these difficult conversations, or how do you want that best self to show up? What relationship do you want with the person that you're having a difficult conversation with? What is your end goal? So if it's with a manager, maybe you want to show up as someone who is an asset to the company, someone your manager trusts, relies on, that performs amazing. You're your manager's thought partner. And so that's your end goal, right? And so during the conversation, you want to show up as that person who is that person that the manager trusts and respects and admires. So coaching can really unlock that. There's some other strategies as well. So listening can be so important because especially when we're in places where we feel very emotional, we might be listening to respond versus listening to truly listen. The other thing is when people tell their stories, we might be like, oh, that's a story. That's not true. Let me butt in and let me tell you what I'm feeling. Let me tell you what the truth is. And so there's another tool of thinking like, what if someone's story, their truth is also valid? What if there's at least 2% truth in what they say? And how can I listen to them from a place of open curiosity? And so with that, when I respond to people, how do I respond with that empathy, that trust, trying to aim us towards our mutual purpose of the future? And how do I respond in a way, if I ask questions, it's open-ended and not leading? Like it's not leading them from their story to mine, but it's just from a place of curiosity, trying to understand their perspective and what they're coming from. And in a place where you're psychologically safe, where your manager truly cares for you, like in the scenario I mentioned, trying to understand where your manager is coming from can be so helpful because you realize, oh, my manager's intent was this. It came off to me as this. And so as a result, we had a conflict. But my manager had really great intentions. I had really great intentions. If we both align on the fact that we have good intentions for each other, we can work through this miscommunication.
Yeah. And Dini, along the lines of what you're talking about with managers, and there's a lot of data out there that's talking about how managers play such a crucial role in the ultimate turnover of employees from organizations. So, in your experience, do you feel like there has been the necessary training for managers around how to approach these difficult conversations and create that psychological safe space that you mentioned is so important? Like, is that training happening today? And I know, you've worked at Google and YouTube and some of the Fortune 500s of the world, and the training for employees in that sort of organization versus, a small to mid-sized 50 employee organization might be quite different. But I guess what are you seeing around that? Are you seeing a difference in how managers are trained around this sort of subject?
Yeah, so I think so many things. I think, first of all, as employees or individual contributors, as people who care about the team culture you're in, we all have a little bit of responsibility in having that fierce courage to have a difficult or uncomfortable conversation when it might support yourself and your company. And I think to that stat I mentioned in the very beginning, we could do a better job of showing up for ourselves, of being open and honest as individuals for what we want. Then as managers, there is a responsibility to your team and to your direct reports. How do you show up for them? And I think there's been a trend of in the past, and in some industries it still exists, but it was very hierarchical. It's very top down. And so as a manager, you tell your report what to do and your report does it. And a lot of companies now, there's a little bit more of a manager as a mentor or a manager as a coach. So how do you help support your how do you support your report? How do you support your individual contributors to show up? And I think the support really depends on, the HR and the top level leadership. So I've been privileged that in big tech, the managers do get training that is very
Yep.
coach-like. And so they learn how to have difficult conversations about performance reviews, about and desires to go out for promo, comfort around reorgs, challenges with work-life balance, and they show up for their teams. And I've also chatted with HR managers of much smaller companies, and they have this passion and this fire to do the same. And what I really believe is,
Yeah.
as individuals, we can make a difference in the workplace with our passions. And all it takes is that, one HR manager
Yep.
or that one manager, and they have a trickle down effect to everyone else they're surrounded by.
100%. And I mean, we believe that managers in whatever capacity do have the biggest ripple effect across the organization. So many good nuggets in there. And I guess, Dini, just to sum it all up, a ton of really good insights. And we mentioned some things that employees can take back into their workplace. I guess any actionable tips for HR leaders listening to this, and specifically if you're a smaller HR team where you don't have all of the resources internally to be rolling out coordinated efforts around this sort of training, what are some actionable tips to be able to take back into your workplace to really create change around how your team is thinking about navigating difficult conversations internally?
Yeah, so it's really my answer is a little bit more philosophical. Like, as an HR leader, how do you train up managers and leaders to have difficult conversations? Yes, there are formal trainings and workshops and lots of really amazing programs that give this training. I chatted with someone who was a director who mentioned, hey, their peer group just started up a peer feedback loop or peer mentorship where they bring difficult conversations to one another, and they discuss like how would they respond in this situation, and they get to learn from each other's wisdom. So there's so many ways of doing it. And then secondly, how do you inspire them to bring some coaching best practice into their everyday management style? So things like, that true listening, coming from a place with deep empathy where you believe the best of your individual contributors and you really lean in on their strengths. And how are you there for them and seeing them as people, not as resources? So how do you bring some of those coaching best practices into the workplace?
Yeah, I think those are all great. And, hopefully are things that we're seeing across businesses that we're working with. And we feel like that's going to be a key to success in the next 10 years is just how are you thinking about the whole human at work is really kind of what we're getting at here. So Dini, we mentioned it at the top that the primary goal of this podcast is for our listeners to be able to bring tangible solutions back into their workplace. So you mentioned some really good nuggets throughout, but if you just had a couple of tangible ways that employees or individual contributors can bring the things you've stated back into their day-to-day, what would some of those things be?
Yeah, and I think what I'm going to say really applies to both individual contributors as well as managers, in case you're a manager having this conversation with your report. So first of all, what outcome do you want for this conversation? What's your goal? The second is, who do you want to be during this conversation? And how would your best self show up? And the third is related to number 2. How can you listen from a place of heart, of deep empathy, trust, and respect?
Love that. Dini, this was all super helpful. Thank you so much for joining us today. If you're listening to this and you're looking to connect more or learn more about our insights or coaching, feel free to go to boon-health.com. Otherwise, we're going to be coming out with more podcasts here around just the critical challenges that employees are facing today. So if you have any feedback, we're going to create an area for comments below. And beyond that, looking forward to having you and appreciate you listening in today.